Today we're going to be talking about Bruno Schulz's book, Nocturnal Apparitions, which really is not per se, it's a collection of his stories from many of his writings that was recently released. And joining us today to help us talk about Bruno Schulz and his legacy is Benjamin Balint. And so I am going to give a short introduction to Benjamin, and then he is going to begin the conversation as usual with a short presentation and some slides. And then we will open it up for discussion. So I'll be very curious to see what other people have to say about the book. I myself, as always, have all my notes ready. So we will uh, have an interesting discussion, I'm sure, especially about such a writer as this, I think. I'm excited to read him. Benjamin Balint, a writer living in Jerusalem, is the author of several acclaimed works of nonfiction, and his newest book, which came out this year, is Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. His previous book is Kafka's Last Trial. That was 2018, and it's been translated into a dozen languages. The book won the 2020 Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. He is co-author with Merav Mack of Jerusalem, City of the Book, in 2019. Balint's first book was 2010, and it's Running Commentary. This book tells the story of how a uniquely influential magazine both forged the neoconservative movement and registered Jews' quote, love affair with America from the Second World War to today. Balint has taught literature at the Al Quds Bard College of Arts and Sciences in East Jerusalem, the first humanities program of its kind for Palestinian students. His reviews in cultural journalism have been published in the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, the Claremont Review of Books, the Weekly Standard, and Die Zeit. His translations from Hebrew have appeared in the New Yorker, Poetry International, and Crazy Horse. Quite a good resume, I have to say, Benjamin. So I will leave it to you to begin your presentation, and you can start the slides as well, Monica, I guess. And when you're done, Benjamin, just let me know, and I'll jump back on, and I'll take it for our discussion from there.
Right. Thank you so much, Michael, for inviting me to today's book club, and thanks to all of you for participating. And I'll just give a briefest of introductions to the life and times of Bruno Schulz before we dive into his stories, which we've read. Bruno Schulz was both a graphic artist and a master of 20th century fiction. And by sort of looking at him as a virtuoso, both of language and image, I think it might help us understand the fiction in and of itself. He was sort of a Polish Jewish William Blake, brilliant in both language and the visual. And I'd just like to say a couple of words about his life, which he lived at a crossroads, not just of Jewish and Polish culture, but of art and eroticism and violence. Let's pull up, Monica, the next slide, which is a photograph of Bruno Schulz at the home, the steps of his home in Drohobych, a place that's now in Western Ukraine, then part of Polish Galicia, which I visited in 2020. He was born in Drohobych, lived in Drohobych his whole life, died in Drohobych. But without moving, he would become, he was born a citizen of the Habsburg monarchy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and without moving, he would be a subject of the West Ukrainian People's Republic until 1919, the Second Polish Republic from 1919 to 1939, briefly the USSR, which occupied Drohobych and this part of Galicia from 1939 to 1940, and finally the Third Reich. So without moving, he's living under these various regimes. His childhood in Drohobych was something that informed the way of the very style and impulse of his writing. I'd like to quote to you something that he wrote about how he imparted special meaning to childhood, because as you've noticed, the stories that we've read are told from the perspective of a child, of a boy. And he wrote an essay about the meaning of childhood for him. He said, were it possible to turn back development, to achieve by some path a repeated childhood, and once more to have its fullness and limitlessness, that would be the realization of an age of genius, of quote-unquote messianic times. My ideal is to mature into childhood. That's sort of the closest that he got to a literary credo, maturing into immaturity. And I think that comes across both in his visual and his literary styles. Galicia at the time was, as you may know, the largest and also most densely populated province of the Austrian Empire. It was this borderland on the far eastern edge of the empire. But I think, to call Galicia borderland, as it sometimes is kind of to adopt a gaze from the center. In this case, the center would be Vienna and all the condescension that Vienna had towards the eastern provinces. But for Schulz, the borderland was the center, right? In the story called The Republic of Dreams, Schulz calls his home this chosen region, this singular province, this city unique in all the world. Well, one of the things that made Galicia in general, and Drohobych in particular, unique was that it was this place of, as we've seen, fluctuating political borders, but also the kind of blurring of borders that shows up in these stories between, let's say, animal and human, between animate and inanimate, between instinct and intellect, between high concerns and trash, between myth and actual history. And part of that also was a blurring of ethnicities and languages, right? Drohobych was often considered, so to speak, 1.5 cities. Mathematically impossible, but that was the richness. It was considered the sort of half Polish, half Jewish, and half Ukrainian, and its streets echoed with a mixture of Polish and Ukrainian and German and Yiddish. And when Schulz was growing up there, more than 40% of Drohobych's inhabitants were Jewish. In the 1920s, he starts to teach arts and crafts, and in the very same high school that he himself went to. He, like Franz Kafka, his contemporary, sort of hated his day job. Kafka was, as you know, a lawyer in an insurance agency, and Schulz didn't like teaching. And whenever he could, he would suspend the lesson and improvise extemporaneous stories, which the kids loved. Since I mentioned Kafka, I'll just say that in this part of Galicia, there were 3 writers, all more or less at the same time, all sort of working at the late fermented, declining empire, right? You have, and in 3 different languages. You have, in very close geographical proximity, Bruno Schulz writing in Polish, Franz Kafka writing in German, Josef Roth writing in German, and Shai Agnon writing in Hebrew. Also in the 1920s, he begins to publish some of his etchings and artworks. And maybe, Monica, we could go to the next slide, which is the only surviving copy of his only surviving painting. He was a very prolific painter, but of course, during the Second World War, so much of what he produced was destroyed, went missing until this very day. But this is the one of his many, many paintings that had survived. It's called Encounter. That's a sort of mythical, idealized landscape of Drohobych in the background. And then if we can go to the next slide, that represents one of the etchings that survived, which is fairly typical in the sense of his kind of masochistic, eroticism. Many of his etchings, this is from something that he published in the 1920s called the Book of Idolatry, depict men groveling at the feet of attractive women. I should say that that's not all of his artwork. That doesn't encompass everything, because he also depicts very beautiful scenes of Drahovich Jews waiting around the well for the Messiah, or around the Passover Seder table, and things like this. So that's in the 1920s, and now we get to finally his stories. Schulz was a brilliant letter writer. And for a time, he says, letter writing was my only creative outlet. And he starts, well, he was engaged, first of all, like Franz Kafka, engaged and broken engagement and never married. And with his fiancée, Josefina Szelenska, he translated the first Polish translation of Franz Kafka's The Trial. But then he started to write these letters to another woman in his life, a Yiddish modernist Polish poet named Dvorah Fogel. By the way, Dvorah Fogel's books are now coming out in English just in the last year or two, and I highly recommend her poetry. And as he's writing these letters to Dvorah Fogel, he's also writing postscripts, descriptions of Drahovich through the eyes of a child, which grow more and more fantastical. Until finally Fogel says these should be published, and puts him in touch with the most prestigious publishing house in Warsaw, and they publish two of his books, Cinnamon Shops and The Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass, in the 1930s. And as you've noticed, the books are these interlaced short stories, which really constellate around three protagonists. You have this sort of sensitive boy, Joseph, named after Jacob's son in the book of Genesis, who's the narrator, in effect narrating kind of his own birth as an artist. You've got the second protagonist is the father, who, like Bruno Schulz's real life father, is an eccentric textile and cloth merchant who has both he's both a merchant and a mystic somehow at the same time, as when he gives his treatises on Genesis, or treatises on mannequins. And then the third main character is the father's sort of arch adversary, the sassy and seductive housemaid Adela, who appears in 19 of Schulz's 32 stories, and is probably based on a real life maid in the Schulz household named Ruchla or Ruchel or something like that. And the appearance of that first book, Cinnamon Shops, vaulted Schulz overnight to the summits of Polish prose. He was regarded as, together with two other writers, Gombrowicz and Witkiewicz, as the kind of three musketeers of Polish writing between the wars. One critic called them Poland's literary Marx brothers. He then, just to finish, really, I just want to say something about his last phase of life. I don't want to put too much emphasis on it, because I resist reading the life of Schulz through his through coercion and what happened to him in the German occupation. But during the German occupation, a particularly sadistic SS officer named Felix Landau, Schulz's art caught his eye, and he basically enslaved Bruno Schulz and made him his pet artist. And he said, "I'll extend your life and give you rations, and in exchange, you'll be my house painter." And he painted Landau and the SS mistresses and etc. And the last thing that Schulz was commanded to do was something that you see on your screen right now. He was commanded by the SS officer to paint 3 walls of the children's room in the SS villa. This SS officer felt so comfortable in his posting that he brought his children along, aged then 2 and 4. Shortly after that, Schulz was shot in November 1942. And shortly after that, these murals were painted over and considered lost, until fast forward in 2001, a pair of German filmmakers, the Geislers, managed to, after a lot of painstaking detective work, find that these murals were in fact in a apartment now owned by an elderly couple, Ukrainian couple, who had no idea what was in their house. Turns out that the children's room had long since been converted into a kitchen pantry, and they took off kind of the shelves and the herring and the pickles, and they were able to take off the outer layer of paint. And what you see is the first time that Bruno Schulz's murals were discovered for the first time. And the next slide is how they look today. 3 months after they were rediscovered, Yad Vashem, together with the Mossad, the Israeli security agency, sent a team of 3 agents to Drohobych, and they spent a night chiseling out 5 fragments from the wall of the children's room, and they repatriated, so to speak, Bruno Schulz's murals and brought them to Yad Vashem. This is a photograph that I took of how they look today on the wall of Yad Vashem. As you can imagine, all hell broke loose because all kinds of international laws were violated in this. Yad Vashem asserted a kind of a moral right that as a victim of the Shoah, Bruno Schulz belongs in Jerusalem. And of course, the Poles objected because for Poland, for the Poles when I was there, it's very clear that Bruno Schulz is a Polish writer. He wrote in Polish. He had nothing to do with Jerusalem. He never stepped foot in Israel, etc. So there was about 8 years of negotiation, and then the story concludes with the next slide, which is that finally they were able to be, 8 years after they were taken, they were able to be put on public display for the first time. There was an agreement signed between Yad Vashem and the government of Ukraine, and it just so happened that one of the first visitors to Yad Vashem that month was then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and this is a photograph of her marveling at the murals of Bruno Schulz. I've gone on too long, but I'll say one more thing, which is that the stories that you've read. Let me say something about the translation that you read. Bruno Schulz was translated after his death into about 40 languages. One of the last languages was Ukrainian. That was only relatively recently, but he's been translated into Hebrew. He was translated in the 1960s into English and made popular. That edition was made popular by Philip Roth, who, as you may know, edited a very influential series for Penguin paperbacks called Writers from the Other Europe. And it's really Roth who single-handedly introduced Bruno Schulz, together with other Eastern European writers like Milan Kundera and Danilo Kish, to the American reading public. And ever since then, a whole procession of writers has become sort of as obsessed as I have with Bruno Schulz. Cynthia Ozick wrote a novel about Bruno Schulz called The Messiah of Stockholm. David Grossman, the Israeli novelist, puts Schulz at the center of his masterpiece, Sea Under Love. I interviewed for my book the Polish Nobel Prize laureate Olga Tokarczuk, who also reveres Bruno Schulz. And then the younger generation, like Nicole Krauss and Jonathan Safran Foer, have also written in their own ways, their own kind of homage to Bruno Schulz. So I'll just conclude with a line from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who, as you know, was Polish born, but didn't write in Polish. He wrote in Yiddish. And he has a whole conversation that's published with between Singer and Philip Roth from the 1980s. It's all about their shared love of Bruno Schulz. And Singer says, look, if Schulz wrote sometimes like Franz Kafka, sometimes like Proust, but in fact was deeper than both of them. And if Schulz had been allowed to live out his life, Singer said, he might have given us, and this is a quote, untold treasures. But what he did in his short life was enough to make him one of the most remarkable writers who ever lived. So this translation that you hold in your hands now is the most recent, by Stanley Bill. And I think also much more fluent and much more captures the sort of snake-like sensual sentences of Bruno Schulz than the previous translations. And I'm looking forward to discussing Schultz's imagination with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Benjamin. That was a great introduction and opening presentation. I thank you very much for it.
Please like and subscribe to receive more content from the Leo Beck Institute.